When I spoke earlier of approximately 200 million people, or 5% of the adult population of the world using illicit drugs, if you just consider cannabis in this 5%, cannabis accounts for 4 of the 5%.
So there's a way in which the system has to hold on to cannabis to give itself bulk, if you like, as an issue. It is hard to prohibit a plant that grows almost anywhere. I think New Zealanders know a good deal about that. The arrest rates are high, and the interesting and puzzling thing is that, in fact, despite efforts at reducing penalties and so forth, in many of the developed countries, the arrest rates have doubled in the last 10 years.
At heart, the debate is still very much driven by some hysteria, by political opposition, but also I think the question around methamphetamine makes it extremely difficult for us to get any traction in terms of cannabis law reform in particular, but a rational discussion about drugs in general. Because in this country there's such a huge passion about meth, about P, that any drug discussion is automatically linked to a P discussion, which then takes it out of the realm of being able to assess proper harms and deal with the issues as they need to be dealt with.
While there will be different views about cannabis, from a police perspective, for those that attempt to diminish the impact of cannabis on our community, I'd just like to provide a quick overview of our last operation in 2007. And also, I think, neatly illustrates the intertwined nature of drugs, money, supply and demand. Over 124,000 plants were destroyed, 780 offenders arrested, 147 firearms seized, over $439,000 in stolen property recovered, 216 kilograms of dried cannabis plant material destroyed, and 9 methamphetamine labs discovered and dismantled.
This conversation for me that you either have to be abstinent or you're going to end up abusing drugs misses the fact that the majority of the people can have a healthy relationship with drugs. But one of the consequences of prohibition is that we don't instruct people how to do it. You know, as a parent, I had to deal with my son wanting to use marijuana. I didn't tell him that he could never use marijuana because he had seen me use marijuana. What I said is that I want you to wait as long as you can until you're closer to being an adult so that you can use it as opposed to having it using you. And that when you do it, I want you to do it here in my house. I want to see you and your friends when you're smoking. I talked to his parents about recognizing the signs of healthy drug use versus unhealthy drug use. If you have a group of kids sitting around together, passing around a joint and listening to music and talking, that is not the same as if you have them sitting in their room by themselves, smoking for hours at a time, not interacting with anybody. But we don't have permission to have those kinds of conversations among ourselves or with our kids, because in the prohibitionist world, the only thing you're supposed to do to be responsible is say no.
Under the control system as we have it, cannabis is controlled with the same degree of severity as heroin and cocaine. Is it as dangerous as heroin and cocaine? This is where evidence falls out of the window and ideology comes in, because nobody can quite make up their mind about how to answer this question.
Although under the Misuse of Drugs Act, you can technically get access to a form of medicinal cannabis. It's a ministerial decision, it's a political decision. In practice, it's virtually impossible. There has been no successful applications. And it is very difficult to make an application. And when I had someone go and investigate it for me, they rang around the ministries to find out how you do it. The Ministry of Health said, we will process an application if you can get a guarantee from Customs that they would allow you to import it, because there's nothing in the law that allows you to grow it and supply it here. You have to import a product from overseas. Customs then said, we will give you a licence to import it if you can get a guarantee from the Ministry of Health that you will be able to use it. So just there, and that one couple of phone calls. You have a bureaucratic administrative block that prevents you being able to access the law which provides for medicinal use under some circumstances.
There hasn't been a lot of conversation about the fact that the global youth movement of the 60s was very much linked to cannabis use, and that the attempt of various governments, particularly Western governments, the United States, the UK, France, et cetera, to suppress those movements was very much linked to the suppression of the drugs that people were using, that were seen as a fuel to this counterculture, sort of anti-establishment attitude. Given that cannabis still remains the #1 illegal drug that people continue to use around the globe, it seems to me very significant that 30, 40 years later, in spite of the fact that so many people use it, that we still have this strong stricture against it. I wonder how much of that is related to the threat that it poses to the overall economic status quo if you allow or sanction its use, #1. And #2, what does it mean for justice systems that across the globe you have a good percentage of the people who were regularly, actively flouting the law without any real fear of consequences?
The evidence tells us that a large proportion of the community actually are supportive of change. In Western Australia, at the Drug Summit, 72% of the members of the Drug Summit voted that they wanted to have decriminalisation or prohibition with civil penalties. They wanted to make sure that it was a treatment and health response as opposed to a criminal response. Funnily enough, a survey conducted by the National Drug Research Institute found that 72% of the West Australian community supported a change. And magically, the Drug and Alcohol Office, which also conducted a separate investigation, found that 72% of the population supported a similar change. It was a magical figure. It was 72 every single time.
The Green Party, like I say, we have a harm minimisation policy. We have a staged introduction in our policy about how we might get to cannabis law reform in particular. We don't have a policy that addresses other drugs except in the public health context. But in cannabis law reform, we say, first of all, the police should be instructed that violent offences, domestic violence, those sort of issues are the top priority for policing and enforcement, and cannabis offences are not. And in the meantime, work on legislation that will then introduce cannabis into what is, I think, Schedule 4 of the Misuse of Drugs Act type of arrangement, regulated use, with some levels of enforcement for under 18s, some management of supply and sale in an enforcement context, but nonetheless, personal use of cannabis by adults being free of any enforcement or criminal prosecutions of any kind, including civil.
Cannabis does indeed have its dangers. They can't be underestimated. The nature of the drug and what is available is changing over time. It's become a lot more potent in some cases, but by and large, all the evidence, at least at the level of empirical evidence and common sense, will tell you that cannabis is probably less dangerous than cocaine and heroin. That does not mean it's harmless, but it's probably less dangerous. If it is less dangerous, is our control system going to be better if we find a different way to deal with it or not?